Well, hello and welcome back for this next in the Dean's Forum series at Christchurch Cathedral here in Grafton. What we're going to do in this particular session is do some work around the topic the once and future Jesus, playing with the idea of afterlives. And really what I'm doing here is I'm drawing on some of the work which is being done for a book which is coming out towards the end of the year, for which I'm the editor, looking at various afterlives of Jesus from different global perspectives. And in particular, I'm drawing on my opening chapter in that book, which has the title, The Once and Future Jesus. So what we're going to be doing here is to do a little bit of work around the reasons why scholars in particular get engaged with the questions of what Jesus was like back then. But I'm also wanting to be looking to the now and to the future and thinking about some of the afterlives of that historical character we call Jesus of Nazareth. So begin with what are really the two or three kind of big seminal questions for this kind of research. The first is the question whether Jesus ever actually existed as a real person. For many people of faith, that's really not even a question they worry about, give any thought to, but it's a question from time to time we do have to address, and we'll touch on that in the first part of this presentation. There are also questions around whether or not, even if Jesus existed, that's not the same as talking about the reliability or the accuracy of the ways in which Jesus is depicted in the Gospels. So we won't be focusing so much on that, but it will have a little bit of attention in today, and we have addressed that in some of the earlier sessions in this series as well. And along the way, we'll also be giving some thought to why questions like this matter. In fact, we'll probably start off with that issue straight away. So one of the reasons why this matters to people, and particularly to historians and to scholars of religion, is that there are actually very good reasons to question the historical value of the New Testament Gospels. And we've looked at this on some of the sessions about mapping the Gospels and so on earlier on in the series. Obviously, the differences between the Synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke and the Johannine Gospel. Differences within the Gospels, even differences within the same Gospel, and some of the profound tensions between the way Jesus is spoken about and described in the Gospels and the way that the rest of the New Testament tends to talk about Jesus, particularly in the letters of Paul. So there are reasons, academic and religious reasons, for questioning and evaluating, critiquing the Gospels themselves. If you're a Muslim, then of course it's a simple question. The Quran says that Jesus existed. It says that he did this and he said that and something else happened. So for most Muslims, that settles the question. But for those of us who are not Muslims, then the fact that the Quran, some 600 years after the time of Jesus, says this or says that, doesn't really settle the question for us. And so we still need to address these questions, think them through for ourselves. Even for people who are not particularly people of faith, they may simply be interested in the questions about, what do we know about Jesus and how much can we know about Jesus as a historical figure, because of the importance of Jesus in terms of world history over the last 2,000 years. So simply as wanting to learn more about someone who's had a huge impact on human history, there will be people who, quite apart from their religious outlook, are interested in these questions. These questions matter for people like that. There's another group of people, sadly, who might be looking for Jesus as well. And these are people who have been hurt by the church, sadly, in some cases victims of sexual abuse by clergy and other church workers, And they're looking for Jesus because they're really hoping that they can go around and beyond the institution which failed them and can find some spiritual wisdom and some grace if they could just tap back into reliable information about Jesus himself. There are also people of other faiths, and this may surprise some people, but in many cases people of other faith traditions are quite interested in Jesus, not because they want to convert to Christianity, but because they want to see which parts of the wisdom of Jesus and the spiritual practices of Jesus could be incorporated into their own religion. And so they're also interested in what was this Jesus character really like, and how can they get, if you like, a share of the action without changing their own religion. And there are also people who are hostile to religion more generally, skeptical of religion, hostile to Christianity perhaps, often for very good reasons, and they will get involved with these questions about historicity and so on, and particularly what's called the Christ myth argument that we'll come to shortly, because for them these are ways of getting rid of what they see as an unhelpful and unhealthy element of our common life, namely religion in general and Christianity in particular. So for all kinds of people, for very different reasons, questions around what Jesus was like once upon a time and what Jesus might be like in the future are questions that matter to them. On one level, they're simple questions. Did he exist? What was he like? Where was he born? And so on. But if you try to do the exercise of filling in a birth and death certificate for Jesus, it becomes rather more complicated. And I realise that a birth certificate and a death certificate is anachronistic when we're talking about somebody from the edges of the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago. But it's a useful exercise to help get us thinking about what do we know, what do we think we know, and why do we think we know that? So it goes to questions like, what do we actually know about Jesus? Like, what was his full name? What was his date of birth? The answer is not December 25, obviously. And this stuff that we think we know about Jesus, where does that come from? Is it out of the Gospels? Is it from Christmas cards? Is it from the nativity play? Is it from some movie we saw at some stage? Where has this information come from that we think we know about Jesus? So let's delve back into some work on Jesus back then, particularly focusing on the historicity of Jesus and what the historical Jesus might have been like. And we'll start with this issue of what's called the Christ myth, although that terminology is itself a little bit misleading, because in a way, Christ myth is a perfectly good theological term saying that the sacred story about the Christ. What they're really saying is that they're talking about the Jesus myth, but they're using the language of Christ myth as a way of addressing it. So the core question is not whether Christ existed, of course, but whether Jesus existed. We're not talking about whether he was remembered accurately by the gospel writers, but whether Jesus even existed at all, or whether Paul or somebody else invented Jesus when starting Christianity. Now, for many people of faith, that's a fairly unsettling question even to hear it expressed, but I want to suggest it's something we don't have to be rattled by. It can just be treated as a perfectly normal and genuine historical question. Whether it is or not, we can certainly treat it in that way. I want to suggest that we could ask exactly the same question about Elijah, or about Amos the prophet, or about John the Baptist. Did they exist? What evidence do we have? What do we know about them? We could ask those questions about those biblical characters, and we can ask those questions about Julius Caesar and about Herod the Great, about Pontius Pilate. But of course, it's much harder to answer the same question when we're asking about a character who has had no major social and political significance in their own lifetime. So people like Caesar, people like Herod the Great, people like Pontius Pilate, to greater or lesser extents, changed the world about them. They left a historical record, they built monuments, they erected buildings, and they left a footprint, they left a trace which the historians can find. That's not so easy to do for people like Elijah or Amos or John the Baptist or, of course, Jesus. So we come to the issue of what counts as evidence. And I want to be suggesting there are several sets of information that we would hope to have when we're answering that question, whether we're talking about Pontius Pilate or John the Baptist or Jesus. The first and most obvious question is, so what evidence do we have about this person? I mean, what is there? Have we dug up their tomb? Have we found books written by them, about them, or whatever? So what is the evidence that we have to work with for each of these people we're talking about? In the case of Jesus, but also Herod and Pilate, what do we know about Palestine in the early Roman period, which is basically from about 50 years or so before the Common Era down to the end of the 1st century. That's what we'd call the early Roman period. What do we know about Palestine? We'll come back to that, but that's a really critical set of information. And then, in the case of Jesus or Pilate or whoever, what demographic, what biographical data is attributed to that person in the stories and in the information that we have in the first set? What do they actually say about Jesus? So, for example, what kind of name does he have? What does that name mean? How does that name fit in with the dynamics of Palestine in the early Roman period, and so on? What is the person's social location? Where is Jesus represented as fitting on the social scale of 1st century Palestine? What kind of family system is he in? Do we have any sense of an extended kinship system? Where does Jesus fit into that? And amongst other things, what kind of work does this person do? How do they pass their time? What is their role within society? What's their occupation? So we'd want to try and gather that information and sift it against what we know about Palestine at the time. Then, of course, we'd be asking questions like, so what accomplishments is this person supposed to have achieved? So again, did this person have political power? Jesus? No. Did they have a track record? Did they have a sort of military career? Did they conquer vast tracts of territory like Alexander the Great? Did they use the power of the army to gain political leadership? Are they associated with any particular scientific or technological innovations? Think Archimedes' principle, for example. Are they particularly connected with some literature that they generated and created? Were they an author, a playwright, a historian, etc.? In the field of religion and philosophy, are they the leader or the founder or a reformer of a particular school of thought or practice? And of course, did they leave behind any monuments? Did they build any cities? Did they create some new kind of highway or water system or whatever it may happen to be? And of course, for a non-elite person like Jesus, most of those will be no, no, no. And so that leads to the question, as we were at the end of the last slide, so what kind of footprint would we expect to find? Because it's no good looking for a Jesus footprint that looks like a Caesar footprint. The kind of evidence we're looking for for someone like Jesus is going to be very, very different from someone like Herod the Great, for example. So how's this going to work out in practice? Well, again, there are 3 or 4 sets of data we might want to be looking at. The first of those that I think is important is what we now know about Nazareth in the first century. It was a small pioneer farming settlement, only created in the last couple of decades of the first century BCE, and perhaps by the time of Jesus was only into its second generation of people, second or third generation. A really small place with very limited facilities and a place that nobody had ever heard of before. And that's important. If you read through the Jewish scriptures from cover to cover, you would never find a reference to Nazareth. So there's no reason to invent the idea that Jesus came from a place that nobody had ever heard of. Okay? Unlike Bethlehem, for example, where there is obvious advantages to saying Jesus was born in the city of David, there's no real advantage in saying Jesus comes from a place called Nazareth that nobody's ever heard of. So Nazareth, what we now know about Nazareth becomes, I think, a really important set of data. Then we look at the literature which mentions Jesus, and of course it falls into 2 major categories: Christian writings, particularly the Gospels and the New Testament, and documents generated by other people from the ancient world. And so in the case of the New Testament, we've not simply got the Christian story, we've actually got independent streams of Christian thinking. So you've got the Pauline stream, and you've got the Johannine stream, and you've got the kind of school of thought which is expressed more in Mark and Matthew, and probably more connected with Antioch up in the north, far north of Syria, southern edge of modern-day Turkey. So we've got different streams of religious and theological expression in the New Testament, and all of them agree that it's all about Jesus. And they all, to some extent, assume, even if they don't describe the person of Jesus, they all assume that he was actually a real human being who had been killed by the Roman authorities and really was dead. That it wasn't a kind of act. Really, he was a real human being who had died because the government killed him. The other thing about the early Christian texts, which I think is important, is that the stories about Jesus are basically stories of Jesus in the Galilee, whereas Christianity after Easter is not about the Galilee. Undoubtedly, there were followers of Jesus still up in the Galilee, and they possibly gave us the Q sayings material. But when you listen to the list of places spoken by the angels in Acts chapter 1, it's, you will be my witnesses. Actually, it's Jesus, not the angel. In Acts chapter 1, verse 8, you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in Judea, in Samaria, and to the ends of the world. And Galilee doesn't get a mention because they're not going there. Okay? So the stories about Jesus in Galilee are not part of the lived experience of the Christian church after Easter. And yet they survive in the stories which those Christians told each other about Jesus. And then we've got references to Jesus from Suetonius and Pliny, Pliny the Elder, and Pliny the Younger, and Josephus and so on, all of which reinforce the idea that we're dealing with an actual historical person, even if we don't know very much about him. This is accepted by even the opponents of Christianity that Jesus was an actual, real human being. The next kind of big evidence question we ask is, well, are there any sort of historical social phenomena from Palestine in the early Roman period which are best explained by the idea that Jesus was a historical person. And that's exactly what we find. The very emergence of the Jesus movement in the decades after Jesus' death in Jerusalem in April of the year 30, that phenomenon, which is quite clear, the Jesus movement did emerge and developed into what we call Christianity, and it did separate from Second Temple Judaism, and they didn't support Jerusalem during the Jewish uprising, and so on and so on. All of this suggests that the best explanation for that phenomenon of early Christianity is Jesus, even if that figure of Jesus has been embellished by legends and distorted with inaccurate data. And then finally there's how does the Jesus and John the Baptist stuff fit in with the politics of the day? It fits perfectly with the dynamics of the troubled succession arrangements after the death of Herod the Great. And everything we know about Jesus, everything we know about John the Baptist fits in very well with the power politics going on, particularly between Antipas and Philip and the emperor in Rome. So, in brief then, this is how I would sum it up. The dynamics of Antipas's dynastic ambitions were to embroil both John the Baptist and Jesus in a protest and reform movement that eventually cost both of them their lives. So that's the historian speaking. Out of that unpromising matrix came the spark of the Jesus movement that eventually morphed into Christianity. Whether Jesus would have agreed to serve as the leader of Christianity, which we all take for granted, is a moot point. He was killed by the Roman provincial authorities in Jerusalem at Passover time in the year 30 of the Common Era. Indeed, it's not even clear that he ever accepted the title Messiah. So that would be my kind of summary of the historicity of the figure of Jesus, that he really did exist, even if the Jesus who existed is somewhat different from the Jesus we imagine in the life and the practice of the church. Now, one part of the thinking and the research which has fed into all that has been scholars such as the Jesus Seminar, but lots of other historical Jesus scholars as well, who have been really focusing their best efforts on trying to understand and make sense of the historical evidence about Jesus. And in particular, I just want to mention the work of the Jesus Seminar, because I'm a member of the seminar, and during its really formative and perhaps most fruitful period, the 15 years or so from 1985 to 2000, the seminar looked at more than 1,500 sayings from the first 300 years after Easter, which were attributed to Jesus by some group of writer or other. Okay, now obviously some of them are duplications, and some of them are things that there is just no way Jesus would have said that. But there are more than 1,500 things supposedly said by Jesus and which have survived in literature, which is extant today, but was composed between Jesus and Constantine, basically. And there were almost 400 reports of things that Jesus is supposed to have done. Healing a leper, raising a widow's son, whatever. Okay. So as they worked through this, they generated two major reports, 5 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the Acts of Jesus. 5 Gospels focused on the sayings of Jesus, and the Acts of Jesus focused on the things Jesus is said to have done. Now, just a comment about some of the attributes of the Jesus Seminar, because I think it speaks to the historical rigour and the intellectual independence of the Jesus Research Project. Not just the seminar, but more generally as well. The first thing about this Jesus Seminar was that it was independent. The scholars who participated did so as individuals, and the seminar itself was not sponsored by or approved by or endorsed by, and did not have to report to any church or any religious organization or any academic academy. So it was entirely independent research. Although the scholars came to participate as individuals, we chose to work collectively. And so most of the reports coming out of the Jesus Seminar Project are collective reports that rather than books by an individual. There's a degree of collegiality, which actually is one of the most interesting and rewarding aspects of the project. The Jesus Seminar saw itself and sees itself as a sustained act of public scholarship. In other words, thinking out loud in public for the public, not in the back room for obscure technical conversation between the experts out of the public eye. As part of that process, the seminar has always chosen to express our findings in plain language rather than in technical theological jargon. And so the seminar will report its results in a very matter-of-fact way and without lots of qualifications and reservations. And so it's much easier for the findings of the seminar to be communicated in the media and to be, if you like, heard, received by regular people on the street and regular people in the churches. And one of the ways we did that was to always ensure that there was a vote taken to measure the opinion in the room at each step in the process. And this was famously done by a voting with a series of colours, sometimes with coloured beads, but more often simply with a checkbox that said red, pink, grey and black. And red meant absolutely yes, I agree with that. Pink meant, yeah, probably. Grey means most likely not. And black means absolutely not. Okay? And then whether we use beads or whether we simply ticked a line, a spot on the line to indicate a score, those results could be tabulated and averaged out. And then we could say, the seminar has voted this particular saying pink or grey or red or black, and people could understand immediately what we were talking about. So independence, collegiality, public scholarship, accessible language, and very clear decision-making, reporting progress as we go along. So as a result of all that process, in this case in my own kind of working through of all that and my own research in addition, this is kind of how I would present a thumbnail sketch, or if you like, this is my working profile for what Jesus, how to make sense of the historical Jesus, the once upon a time Jesus as distinct from the future Jesus. Firstly, I'm persuaded Jesus was an actual historical person for all the reasons we've just been talking about. I would date his life to very late in the Herodian period, and of course he's executed by Pilate in the year 30. So at the time of his death, Jesus is anywhere from 25 to 45 years old, somewhere in that sort of period, not necessarily 33, as your Sunday school teacher might have told you. He had a family. His parents were Joseph and Mary. He had 4 brothers. Jesus and his 4 brothers all had very traditional Jewish names, all come out of the Old Testament. And he had 2 sisters, at least 2 sisters, possibly more, whose names are not recorded, which is unfortunate, but we can be reasonably certain that one of them would have been called Mary or Miriam, simply because half the Jewish girls in Palestine in the 1st century were called Miriam or Mary. Most likely he was born in Nazareth, not Bethlehem, for all the reasons I've already mentioned. And Nazareth was an observant Jewish farming settlement which was in the spiritual orbit of Jerusalem, 100 kilometres to the south, rather than in the cultural orbit of the nearby city of Sepphoris, which was only 5 k's away. At the time of Jesus, Nazareth probably did not have a school or a synagogue, and Jesus was probably illiterate. There simply would have been no reason for the boys of Nazareth to be taught to read and write, because there was no use for that skill in the farming village of Nazareth. He probably adopted his father's occupation as the village handyman or blacksmith. The Greek word that's used is tekton, from which we get words like technology. And we might think of him not so much as a carpenter, but as a smith, as in silversmith, tinsmith, blacksmith, coppersmith, somebody who was able to work with his hands in order and with materials to create and to fix equipment and furniture. The village religion provided oral formation in the beliefs, the practices, and the stories of the Jews as the covenant people, the chosen ones. And Jesus would have imbibed those traditions as he listened and as he participated in the village rituals. He probably spoke Aramaic as his first language, but he may also have had some Hebrew for religious practices, and he may have had a little bit of Greek for when he goes to the shops in the markets at Sepphoris. And interestingly, for a Jewish man, he appears to have chosen to be celibate and single, and that could also reflect that he was much younger than we typically imagine him to be. I know there's lots of romantic ideas about Jesus and Mary Magdalene, but there's no historical basis for those kind of romantic scenarios. Jesus was drawn into the Jewish reform movement led by John the Baptist, and he later emerged as John's probable successor following the arrest of John by Herod Antipas in about 28, the Common Era. Unlike John, who worked from a fixed location, Jesus engaged in an itinerant mission, moving out among the villages in the northern areas, which were controlled by Antipas and Philip, who were themselves competing with the goal of succeeding their father Herod. Jesus' public activity may only have lasted about 18 months, much, much shorter than we often realise. For Jesus, the big focus of everything he was doing and saying was preparing people for the arrival of the kingdom or the empire of God, and that displaced all other kinship and social obligations. Getting ready for the kingdom became the only thing that mattered for Jesus, which could be why he remained single. Both Jesus and John were executed by the Roman imperial authorities, working collaboratively with their local Jewish collaborators. So they both come to a very similar end about 18 months apart. One killed by Antipas, the other executed on the orders of Pontius Pilate. So that's what we can say about the once upon a time Jesus. What can we say about the afterlives of Jesus? What Jesus became in the years and the centuries following his life? What we mean by afterlife is not life after death, but the ongoing impact of a person, of a text, or an idea. So, for example, the idea of Robin Hood has an afterlife, and we talk about people doing good, perhaps redistributing wealth, and so on. We will sometimes use the metaphor of Robin Hood. And there are lots of other examples, but actually Jesus is probably the best example of an individual with so many different afterlives in literature, in religion, in culture, in politics, in music, in art, and so on. Jesus has had numerous afterlives, and those afterlives probably actually tell us more about each other than they tell us about Jesus. But one thing I think the churches have to come to terms with is that Christianity's exclusive franchise on the, if you like, the Jesus label has expired. It's no longer our monopoly. And people are now going to decide for themselves what sense they're going to make of Jesus and how they're going to put that into practice in their own lives. And so we are already seeing, and indeed have always seen, many different ways of doing the Jesus thing, which doesn't mean they're all equally valid and equally good. Some of them are actually disastrous. Some of them are toxic. One of the chapters in the book that I'm editing at the moment looks at the Aryan Jesus, how during the Nazi period, Jesus was reimagined as a non-Jewish Aryan Nazi. Okay? Not a valid interpretation, not a healthy interpretation, but actually a toxic and disastrous interpretation. So during the first 100 years, we can see already there's incredible diversity. I'm just going to name a couple of the big kind of tendencies during the first century. So as I mentioned, back in Galilee, there are the leftovers of the Jesus people. So people like Peter disappeared off to Antioch and Rome and what have you. And we don't know what happened with James and John and some of the others. But the sense seems to be that the 12, the leaders of the early Jesus movement, did not go back to Galilee but went somewhere else. Okay? But there were still people back in Galilee who were doing the Jesus thing. And they, amongst other things, created what we call the Q gospel, or the saying source. Meanwhile, Paul and Peter and Barnabas end up in Antioch. Later on, we have the Didache being produced in that general area. And later on again, we have the Gospel of Matthew coming out of the church there, as well as the example of Ignatius, the Bishop of Antioch, who eventually goes to Rome, where he's put to death as a martyr. So Antioch is a major centre for early Jesus afterlives. According to the book of Acts, it's in Antioch that the followers of Jesus are first called Christians. Okay? Not followers of the way, but Christ, little Christ, Christianoi. So there's a significant afterlife indeed. Meanwhile, there's Paul planting his assemblies of God, as they were called, the Ecclesia to Theou. And in the Greek city-states, the Ecclesia was the, if you like, the parliament for the local city-state. It was the forum where the members of the demos exercised their democracy, their rule of the demos. And the demos were not slaves, and they weren't women, and they weren't foreigners, but the native-born male landowners, owners, would gather together to make the rules for their society. So Paul is setting up what he calls the Ecclesia to Theou, the assemblies of God, where the people of God, the citizens of the empire of God, are gathering together to begin to inaugurate the new age. Again, a whole fascinating afterlife for Jesus. The Gospel of Thomas emerges through the latter part of the first 100 years, and it's much more interested in Jesus as a teacher of spiritual wisdom and not at all interested in Jesus the miracle worker or Jesus the one who dies on the cross. A very different afterlife from what we find in Paul's letters or the Gospel of John. Speaking of the Gospel of John and the epistles of John, here we have a group of people gathered around this idea of the beloved, the disciple who Jesus loved, the one who guarantees the validity of their tradition and whose understanding of Jesus is so different from Paul and so different from what we find in the Synoptic Gospels. Another afterlife, even in the first 100 years. Towards the end of that first 100 years, there's a character called Marcion, who doesn't figure much in modern church imagination because he's seen as the first official heretic, but actually he's the guy who invented the New Testament. Not quite the form we have it now, but it was his initiative in trying to eradicate any Jewish influence in Christianity, get rid of the Old Testament, create a new Bible just made up of the Gospel, probably more or less the same as Luke, plus the letters of Paul and everything else thrown out. That triggered the momentum which led to the New Testament as we have it. So Marcion has his own product. He produces his own set of afterlives for Jesus, and in the process creates, if you like, the first New Testament. And then, partly in response to Marcion, you've got the massive 2-volume work of the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, which kind of reclaim the Old Testament, reclaim the Jewish tradition for Christianity, place Jesus as part of an ancient tradition that has echoes of the Old Testament in the opening chapters of Luke's Gospel, and reassures the Romans that we're not here to change the world, we just want to be good citizens and so on. And so Luke and Acts, in Luke and Acts, we see the emergence of early Catholic Christianity. Again, another afterlife for Jesus. And of course it continued on long after the first 100 years, right down to today, and indeed there'll be more afterlives to come yet. So from the year 30, where Jesus is crucified as a threat to the Roman Empire, to 325, almost exactly 300 years later, the Emperor Constantine convenes the Council of Nicaea to sort out some of the afterlives of Jesus, including the divinity of Jesus, which is quite an afterlife. Through that 300 years, there's been a diversity of afterlives. Christians have been in competition with traditional Greco-Roman Hellenistic religion. They've been competing with the mystery cults, and they've been struggling with dualistic tendencies within Christianity and beyond Christianity. There's been a struggle with what we call Gnosticism. There's been a growing separation and divergence from Judaism, and a growing anti-Semitism in the early Christian movement. And of course, within Christianity itself, there's been incredible conflict and controversy and argument over the meaning of Jesus, as competing afterlives of Jesus were in competition with each other. And in a sense, that's what the Council of Nicaea was, an attempt from the top down to kind of stop this process and just have one official afterlife for Jesus. Now that story during the first 300 years has just been given an incredibly extensive examination in this 3-volume set which came out during 2020, The Reception of Jesus in the First 3 Centuries. Volume 1, From Paul to Josephus, just within the first century. Volume 2, From Thomas to Tatian. Volume 3, From Celsus to the Catacombs. An incredible collection of scholarship, playing with the theme of the reception of Jesus, which of course is the other side, the other metaphor you put alongside the afterlives of Jesus. How has Jesus been received? How he's been understood? What are some of the afterlives of Jesus during the first 300 years? The project that I've been involved in is a much smaller project, about 33 chapters, and they're organised into 3 chunks, 3 sections. The first group of chapters deal with historical afterlives, the once and future Jesus, parables, finding Jesus in the Psalms, Jesus and apocalyptic, and so on. So a whole set of really essays about historical questions about Jesus, partly back then, but also historical questions about Jesus today. The second set of essays are interfaith afterlives, looking at Jesus through a Muslim lens, looking at Jesus through a couple of different Jewish lenses, looking at Jesus in Hinduism, Confucianism, in Mormonism, and so on. So understanding Jesus from a number of different interfaith perspectives, not picking one as being right or not agreeing with all of them, but simply saying These are some of the diversity of the interfaith afterlives of Jesus. And the final section of this particular collection is looking at cultural afterlives of Jesus. Jesus through the eyes of Indigenous Australians, Jesus through the eyes of a Maori woman, Jesus through Pacific eyes, Asian faces of Jesus, the post-colonial Jesus, and Jesus in film and so on. Jesus from the perspective of women, and two very different perspectives actually in those final two chapters. So a whole series of cultural afterlives that look at the way that Jesus has an afterlife or a set of afterlives in our current ongoing cultural experience. So I want to finish with thinking about the next afterlife for Jesus. And the next afterlife for Jesus, in a nutshell, is when you look in the mirror. But let's just unpack that a little bit. Probably important to remind ourselves that critical research into the historical Jesus of the past will never capture Jesus. But these readings of the Gospels can generate insights about Jesus and Christianity, which then inspire us to practice Christianity in fresh and innovative ways, or indeed to practice whatever faith we hold in fresh and innovative ways. My suggestion is that new afterlives for Jesus are constantly being generated. The process is never going to finish. In every time, in every cultural setting, indeed in every individual human who takes Jesus seriously, another afterlife for Jesus is being created. In my view, at least, the future of the Jesus tradition will be shaped by its capacity to transform itself from an exclusive religion to an inclusive spiritual movement that engages with the best insights of human knowledge as well as the wisdom of other religious communities. And the final point I want to suggest for your reflection is that perhaps everybody who intentionally practices their Christian faith is crafting yet another afterlife for the Galilean sage. Thanks for being with us.